Well, every year in fantasy football, in the top 10 of wide receivers, it turns over, what is it, 60%? Well, Bloom, you may know the exact number, but wide receiver turnover is a thing in top 10 fantasy wide receivers, and that's what we're here to talk about today, Bloom.
Yeah, and I think that it's always changing, and that's really what the important thing right now in fantasy football is to wrap your mind around what situations are going to change and what the range of outcomes are. And we'll commit to our favored point on that range of outcomes, but we know there's going to be turnover. We know there's going to be change because there's quarterback change. Cease, I was just having your name ring out on a show I did with Alex Caruso, football guy. TikTok, check out his TikTok about Cortland Sutton. Cortland Sutton is a player. Absolutely, he has the top 10 in his range of outcomes. Oh, yeah. And that's what we need to start understanding are the players that were outside of the top 10 that at least can reach the top 10, maybe because of changes in their situation. Allen Robinson comes to mind also. And maybe the players in the top 10 that aren't going to repeat.
And maybe some players they planned on being there that aren't there that we're going to talk about there. But Matt Waldman, I guess we'll start today's show out just with the why question. Like running back, there's some turnover in top 10, of course, but wide receiver just seems to constantly be changing.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing. I mean, when you take a look at the numbers, I mean, I've certainly done that in the past when I study rookies, because when you look at it from a dynasty perspective, a lot of people are always saying, well, I want to get a wide receiver who's going to be a number one for the next 10 years. And it's like, well, you know, that's true, but I want to hit the Powerball 3 times in a row too. I mean, because that's pretty much the frequency of what you're going to get there. I mean, when you can name guys like Andre Johnson, Julio Jones, and then after that, Deshaun Jackson, and then people go, Deshaun Jackson, well, yeah, that's because he hit wide receiver 1 in like 8 games 3 times and then was out for the rest of the year and sunk your fantasy team, you know. But that just tells you how difficult it really is to achieve that kind of production, mainly because there's some, you know, it's a factor where they're reliant on another player. And then that player is reliant on 6 other players oftentimes, you know, so as a result of that, their little changes can make a big difference, you know, at that position. And it's also a position that does, after a while, you do have some breakdown with that too. I mean, there's, you know, we may not look at it with the level of like running backs and the drag and the, you know, the sea monsters at the edge of the cliff with age, but you know, there is some factor there with wide receiver too, that as they get a little bit older, you know, certain styles of play breakdown or certain ways that the game changes can also change how they play. Like Des Bryant can suddenly become an obsolete player because he's not a complete route runner in the manner that, you know, teams would demand. Right. So things like that can happen as well, or the way that people cover guys, because a good example of this is Chase Claypool. We'll end with him. Is that Chase Claypool, you know, you watch him coming out of Notre Dame, and he was basically a big dude who could go up and win the ball with speed by basically out leaping people. But you look at that from the NFL perspective and say, well, long term, that's not going to work out unless he becomes a really top route runner. Well, he looked good to begin his rookie year. He was a top 10 wide receiver to begin the year. And then defenses decided, oh, we're going to cover him tighter at the catch point. We're going to play zone where we're going to roll over our zone as his the first priority and let the other guys catch underneath. Because obviously, if the ball's close enough where it's not contested, he'll make the catch. And since then, he really hasn't been remotely a wide receiver 1. And maybe a guy that, you know, if he doesn't put it together this year, the Steelers may be looking elsewhere, you know, as it's future with them. Exactly.
Right. We got a news story about Chase Claypool. We'll get into it just a little bit. Bloom, you're nodding your head. You're so in agreement with Matt there, talking about other people making those wide receivers. And also, I'm going to throw this one at you. We talk about it, and we usually talk about it with against the run, like you got to be strong -1. Well, drop 8 is a thing. Mm-hmm. It's just a thing. I've talked to Justin Simmons about it. I've talked to DJ Jones about it. Like everyone's dropping 8. Well, that changes how things are for wide receivers as well.
Yeah, and as Matt was describing Chase Claypool, or as he was talking about Des Bryant going obsolete, I'm thinking, why are you busting on Kenny Golladay like that? I mean, it's a similar situation where as the game changes, as the emphasis on the passing game changes, then hey, this is going to be something where the game can pass players by, and then it can circle back around and pick them back up. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, this isn't necessarily a straight line; it's more of a circle. But we have to know where we are on that Ferris wheel. And with all the change, I want to bring in just a more mundane factor of why top 10 turnovers happening in the last couple of years, where there used to be your wide receivers in the first and second round were really a cut above everybody else. Now we've only been seeing 3 or 4 guys emerging from the pack, and then there's a big pack, and maybe 2 or 3 points a game separates wide receiver 5 or 6 from wide receiver 35. And it's those environmental factors that make the difference. So that's why I was just looking over this stuff this morning, guys. And here's a bunch of players. I mean, look, if we're going to talk about the top 10 this year, Kupp is in there, Jefferson's in there, Chase is in there, Diggs is in there, Adams is almost certainly in there. So I mean, that gets us to 5. It's hard to also not include CeeDee Lamb and Mike Evans, because Chris Godwin's coming off of a week 15 ACL tear. So that really seems like it's going to be Evans' offense. Gronk's going to play, but Evans is really rock solid. Then we still haven't mentioned Tyreek Hill or Keenan Allen. But listen, there's a bunch of guys, or Deebo Samuel, but there's a bunch of guys on the rise, but you just don't love their situation, right? DJ Moore, Terry McLaurin, AJ Brown, Michael Pittman. Maybe he's an interesting guy because the situation is getting better, but it's not difficult to picture any of them finishing in the top 10. So in some ways, we end up splitting hairs about that top 10 designation. But that should affect our draft strategy. It should make us think like, hey, 3rd, 4th, 5th round, you can get wide receivers you're going to like, Allen Robinson's, Courtland Sutton's, and maybe it's back to focusing on running back early, which I think was prevalent last year too.
Yeah, it was prevalent last year, but this year, Bloom, let's go over that list, and I'll throw it back at you, starting with number 10. This is for fantasy points for the entire season, okay? So guys that miss some time, whatever, they won't be in this top 10. But does anyone think Hunter Renfrow is going to finish top 10 again?
Right.
With Davante Adams there? Like now Renfro's gone. Adams is obviously there. But how far does he fall? Or could it be possible for that offense to support 2 top 10 fantasy wide receivers?
Well, 3 if you count Darren Waller.
Darren Waller, that's the problem.
Yeah.
Certainly projecting Davante Adams and Tyreek Hill are both tough projections this year, because we know what their ceiling was, but how ideal was their quarterback connection? Like how much, I know that Derek Carr played with Davante Adams. Now we heard this morning too that Adams was trying to engineer a trade, according to David Carr. He said Derek's brother, I'm assuming David, that Adams has been trying to engineer this trade for a while. But will that translate to on the field production? How much of Davante Adams' production was because, well, Aaron Rodgers was playing his own game at times, and that's targeting Davante Adams. Tyreek Hill with Tua and Jalen Waddle. And I'll just throw this out there, guys. I'll drop this in the middle of the room. Alex asked me to come up with a hot take, right? A plant your flag kind of take. So just for the sake of making it hot and spicy, it's a Jalen Waddle will outproduce Tyreek Hill. And what I'm really trying to get at with that is I think it's uncertain who's going to be the better target for fantasy week to week, especially if defenses focus on Hill, because Hill and Waddle, I don't think we've even come close to seeing the best of Waddle. Matt, you alluded to this. So I think even solving that situation, solving the Raiders passing game, like you said, plus Josh McDaniels is going to put his imprint on that. What does that mean? And what if Renfro's the Welker? What if Adams is playing more of a downfield role? There's a lot of questions, and I understand why people might not have a hard position on that, but these are the questions you should be thinking about.
Right. What if Renfro's the Edelman? Then there's fantasy production there, even with Davante Adams, even with Darren Waller. But Matt, FQD 1911, our guy, asked about Tyreek Hill. Bloom had his hot take with Jalen Waddle. Well, we all know Tua, doesn't have the prettiest deep pass. Tyreek Hill loves the deep pass. So how much does that play into what Tyreek Hill does or doesn't do this season?
Well, we love you, FQD 1911, and appreciate you being on. And I'll get to that one in a bit, but I want to talk a little bit more about the Raiders, because I think Bloom brings up a really great point about, he says, well, what about Josh McDaniel? What about the imprint of a new offense? And when I start looking at projections and I start looking at the past 3 years worth of projections for each team, and start looking at the stats and see how similar most of them are in terms of targets, touches, even with coaching changes from year one, from, basically when from the previous regime to the next regime, it usually takes a year for a coach to make that fine of an imprint unless disaster strikes. So, for instance, like Josh McDaniel and, your quarterback, your quarterback room gets bare. And then, you force Cecil to have to ask Russell Wilson about whether he would like to back up Tim Tebow in Denver, But those situations, look at Arthur Smith in Atlanta. I mean, you could talk about Calvin Ridley being gone and that, that changing things and them being forced to throw to their backs a lot and not being able to run the ball as much as they would like because they didn't have a great running back. But you could also just say their offensive line was bad. Their offensive line before Arthur Smith came, and Arthur Smith didn't have magic fairy dust to turn these offensive linemen into all pros. So is Josh McDaniel going to be able to do the same thing with them? So I want to put that out there as a hint for all teams that if you have new coaching staffs, that it usually takes a year before you start to see them make an imprint on their team. So you might not want to be like automatically like, well, Josh McDaniels is going to want to run the ball as much as he did in New England. And we're not going to know which back is who's going to be able to do what for which team. It's going to be just like New England. Well, maybe in 2 years. But in terms of Tyreek Hill and Waddle, the short answer is like last week, Waddle to me was not as far away from Jamar Chase in skill as many people might have thought. And the fact that he could play the Jarvis Landry role last year in Miami as a slot receiver just speaks volumes, because if you tried to put, Henry Ruggs into that spot or name a fast wide receiver who really, John Ross in that spot, you weren't going to be able to get the reliability that you would get from a guy like Waddle. So Waddle's quite a versatile guy, and it is going to be tough because is that Miami offensive line up to the task to be able to support deep shots? And if they're not, both players can get a lot of yak, but the player that's most comfortable with Tua right now is Waddle. So he's the safer bet in terms of floor. But upside, you probably have to give it to Hill just based on historical performance and what's proven of what he can do. But it's not that far away. I agree with Bloom that they could be very close.
Can I interject on or just piggyback on this too? Because Mike McDaniel, right? Change. I mean, really, the next couple of months, all you should be thinking about is what's changed. How's it going to manifest? Mike McDaniel, the totally different kind of head coach than we've seen before. So we at least can take a shot at like the closest thing we've had, like one of us, right? One of us being a head coach. And I think the Rams did this before, where once it was Sammy Watkins, I know, where you almost sense a willingness to, like chess, to trade a piece strategically for something else. In other words, you use a player tactically in a way that it doesn't result in production, which is what we care about in fantasy, but it's actually the smartest way to use the player. And doesn't it make sense to use Tyreek Hill to clear out, give the running game, which that's going to be Mike McDaniel's focus, right? I mean, just think about how Deebo Samuel has been used. Use a player to clear out in the deep passing game, and you also use Hill's speed. I like to compare him to the tennis ball and the dog. I mean, you just move Tyreek Hill, and the defense is going to react to that, and contemplating that when you design plays and you do misdirection, especially in the passing game. I mean, you can feast, but the point is, go ahead.
Why didn't that work for the run game in Kansas City?
Well, because I just don't think that was an emphasis.
And I don't think they're dedicated to the run.
Yeah, they're just not. That's not their identity.
And
that's not Andy Reid's identity.
That's true of Andy Reid. That makes sense.
Yeah, but I think it is Mike McDaniel's identity. And so I just think that when we project out how this offense could go, I very easily could see Tyreek Hill having much more value to the offense in a role that doesn't result in production. Like Cecil said, it's not Tua's deep ball isn't exactly the best part of his repertoire, but the defense still has to honor it. And that can give this whole offense a lot more room to function. But like Matt said, with the offensive line, also, I know that I'm guilty of getting over eager. And maybe this is something we see in year 2. Maybe this is something we see when everybody's really learned the system. But at least
when Skylar Thompson takes over.
And exactly. That's what it's all about. Look, since I've been like hogging the floor here for a second, I do want to make sure to say something because I know Cecil might have to tip on out a little early. It's been a sad week in the NFL. Jeff Gladney died earlier this week.
Marion Barber.
I really wanted to mention Marion Barber because Marion Barber came along at a time when we were first getting started, guys. Right? I mean, Marion Barber's time was whenever we were still just like a garage band, you know? And one of the things I remember about Marion Barber is he had this intense tranquility, like a samurai almost. I mean, really different. He was a real different guy. There was that clip of him playing the piano by himself in his dark apartment in Hard Knocks that year. It was like the peak of his career. And it just showed, I thought was one of the most emblematic moments to show people like all of these players are human beings that have all these sides that you'll never even understand, you know? And I thought it was just one of the most human moments it could show. I think it was right next to Terrell Owens having a party at his apartment. And I think we know that Terrell Owens that was a suicide attempt, and that happened in the middle of the season and all that crazy theater. So it's just a moment to take out to just again, like we talk about this game, but obviously the grind. And Jeff Allen had a really good thread on Twitter talking about, hey, the grind and the trauma a lot of these players come from. You know, he said kickers, punters, quarterbacks. There's some privileged people at those positions, but otherwise, a lot of football players did not come from privilege, and they absorbed a lot of trauma, and that trauma makes them tough, but they never deal with it.
I think a good thing just for people to take away from anything that we've had going on in our world, whether it's in the NFL or outside of it, is that people are complicated.
Yeah.
And if you can learn, to accept the fact that people are complicated, then maybe you won't be judgmental. You'll be less judgmental. You'll strive to be a little bit more understanding. Maybe you can look in the mirror a little bit more and realize that how you relate to people in a complicated way. And the more that you can embrace the fact that people are complicated, the more that you give them room to grow and be patient with the process of growing, and that maybe their growth is going in a different direction than yours, and that's okay too.
It is the Audible Live here. Cecil Lammey, Sigmund Bloom, and Matt Waldman. And Bloom, can we get a message to Diontae Johnson? One, whatever you're doing is not going to work with Pittsburgh.
Right.
If you're going to get paid, it's not going to be with the Steelers. But as I look at the top 10 in wide receivers, he was number 8 last year. There's no way. Are you even putting him at 18 this season? Right. And I don't care. Kenny Pickett's 3rd. Like, I don't care. Yeah. Mitchell Trubisky. Yep. I don't care. I am not. We had it in the chat room earlier. Aaron Martinez said, so Cortland Sutton or Diontae Johnson?
Right.
It's Sutton for me, as Russ is going to cook, and who the hell knows what they're making in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, and I would, again, I was just looking over my wide receiver rankings and grappling with some of these types of questions. And the thing about Diontae Johnson is, like you said, Cease, the environment's not going to be great. How much of his value was because Ben Roethlisberger, the best thing this offense had going for it was Ben Roethlisberger just throwing short passes, just like a quick 7-on-7 drill. And that led to numbers for Diontae Johnson, but this was an inefficient offense. Guys, the Steelers' offensive line is terrible. It's terrible. I mean, really, name one starter on the offensive line, or name one guy who would start, in a decent offensive line. So I don't even know if I want to rely on any Steelers.
We already put tofu in the Primantis.
Right. There's no vegan version of that. Right. So the point is that, yeah, exactly. This is like a vegan Primanti Brothers sandwich, but it's not going to be very satisfying. Diontae Johnson's not going to be very satisfying, whether it's Kenny Pickett or not. I just see a drought coming. It is really already there last year, but Najee Harris got so much volume. And I just think the Steelers offense is turning into one to avoid. And again, there's these players. I'm just tossing these names out here just to see if there's any y'all want to run with. DJ Moore has to play with Sam Darnold. DK Metcalf has to play with, well, who knows? Terry McLaurin and Carson. Newton. Right. Cam Newton. Terry McLaurin with Carson Wentz. Maybe that's kind of a little upgrade. I don't know. AJ Brown, Jalen Hurts is not necessarily a bad passer, but how many pass attempts is it going to be per game on that team? So Darnell Mooney with Justin Fields. I mean, these are all players that are on the upslope of their career. And if they take a big step and their quarterback can take a step with them, their top 10's in their reach, but also they might be players that you're not even trusting to play week to week.
Matt, you can make fun of the Steelers if you'd like, but I want to hit on something that Bloom said a couple of minutes ago, because I think it might be the most important thing that's said in this entire show. Now and over the next 2 months during the break and during minicamp, basically, is the best time to prepare in fantasy football. It really is. come August, there's a lot of information. There's a lot of noise. You get more people out there right now. When I was at the Broncos yesterday, Matt, sick flex, bro. Weird flex, bro. Anyway, when I was at the Broncos, there was probably 4 media members there, maybe. And practice wasn't open to us. When practice was, there's probably 20. But in training camp, that's going to be 100. Now you've got all these different people and everyone's got their guy. And I call them the part-timers, Matt. I'm a credential snob. You guys know that. The audience knows that. Like, I hate when anybody gets a badge for whatever. Come to Mobile. Anyway, take your selfies. I look at it and I go, well, now is the time where you get even better information. Now's the time when you're not reacting to preseason. Preseason changes fantasy draft boards. But I think right now, like Bloom said, over the next couple of months, this is what you need to be thinking about. And I really do believe that there's paralysis by analysis in August, especially leading up to your draft at the end of August. Now is the best time to study, examine, listen for those drum beats that we get.
I would agree with that. And I think that there's a lot to be said about that. It really comes down to knowing what to listen to and what not to listen to at both sides, in both areas of time. And I would say this is a period of time where certainly you want to, listen to training camp about who's catching people's eyes from the scope of how much opportunity they're going to get to compete in August. And I think that that's a very safe thing to look at. Also looking at the data and preparing with the numbers and being able to say how much, I strongly recommend not looking at, if you're not doing projections and looking at like 2 to 3 years worth of data to inform how many targets and touches and volume that each position gets, and tie those positions to how, tie receiving yards to passing yards, tie rushing yards to the percentage of rush to the percentage of pass for these teams, and look at 2 to 3 year averages. If you're not doing that or working with someone who's doing that with you, you're not going to get the perspective to see which teams really have the most potential to change and which ones have the most potential to stay pretty balanced with what you're doing. And then when it comes to camp, I mean, I think, practice footage, people who are there year round are a little bit better about how they look at practice footage. And I put up a thread on Twitter about practice footage this week that just was kind of like, listen, there's just some things to keep in mind when you see these things posted in August on social media. And it's there's 10 real quick things you could look at. I mean, like, things like with quarterbacks and release motions. Most people don't really understand how quarterback technique works. So if they're going to comment on like a quarterback's releases, you may get too wrapped up in isolated reps without understanding, what the quarterback was looking at, and what they were trying to do. And they use different release motions, acrobatic catches. These are fun things to see, but sometimes the wide receiver creates the problem that they have to solve. And that can be a bad thing. I mean, Juwan Winfrey was a guy that the Broncos were talking up for a year or two.
Making plays, yeah.
And he was making plays in camp. And, you even got cornerbacks talking about, well, he could be really good in a couple of years. And that he may very well get a chance to surprise in Green Bay, but he's been sticking at the end of Green Bay's roster for 2 years now as well. And sometimes that's because people see moments, even players comment on athletic ability. So you're going to hear lots of comments about athletic ability rather than like find high-end technique and concepts, because the people who do that, who are athletes at the NFL game, are usually the elite guys, because they're the ones who study those levels of details. So like slick hot route highlights without understanding whether it's against man or zone, or whether, it's a two-way go or man-to-man, or, these types of things, or, running back making a catch that you're only going to see like 4 targets all year of that type, doesn't mean the guy's the next Marshall Faulk. And you're going to see a lot of these things. They're going to get lots of eyeballs on social media because it's pretty, but it's not substantive into what you're trying to do. So look at August. I think, as Cecil brings up, it's the great mirage in terms of what goes on. And I would stick more to, if you really have a fundamentally sound plan of how you how you prepare for your draft. Don't let these things change you. And the things that do need to change you is if a player is suddenly going to get a lot more competition, more opportunities. Isaiah Crowell, who was a UDFA, as I joked, is some sort of kink term on Tinder for most fantasy people because they 90% of them don't know what UDFA means. And it gets in a way with the beer commercials. So, I would say that it's one of those things that Crowell, Deion Lewis was ahead of him. The kid out of Towson was ahead of him. He wasn't even planning on making the roster until two guys got hurt in the end of the third preseason game, and suddenly he's a starter and nearly gets 1,000 yards that year. It wasn't because he was bad. It was just because he didn't get a lot of reps. And there are going to be some guys who emerge because they didn't get a lot of reps. But if they get that opportunity and that they have talent because people have looked at them in the past and be able to tell you about their talent, whatever analyst it is, you have a shot at that point to then make that move and pivot to those types of players and give them a chance. But to change your mind on a player based on some highlight clips, based on things you already know, that's where you can get a little out of bounds.
Bloom, now is the time, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and some of the things I'm looking for, guys, again, having to do with change, are things about an offense, right? The Jets, Mike LaFleur, someone said he was smirking, saying basically, we're going to spread the ball around. We have a lot of options in this offense. That should inform you in your projections. I think that when Adam Thielen says this is the most learning he's had to do in one offseason for the Vikings under Kevin O'Connell. Okay, it's going to be different. I mean, you just open your mind to that. It's going to be different if you're looking at Dalvin Cook and you're weighing him against Austin Eckler. You're weighing him against other running backs in the first round. How could that affect Dalvin Cook? Or could it potentially help a player like Justin Jefferson? What does it mean for Irv Smith? Obviously, it's a question mark, but the point is you should be open to these changes. And then as the new information starts to come in, you'll know how to use it to inform your particular attack or direction. And Cecil, I think what you're going to be reporting from Denver is huge because we could put a line through probably half of the league and say, look, things are going to be roughly the same as last year. All right. The Chargers, okay, Isaiah Spiller, and so on. So then you can narrow down your focus to where there's change and you can start to get those clues and those drips. And then at the other end, I love that Matt mentioned a UDFA running back because, guys, this is one of the more interesting UDFA running back or late drafted running back classes to monitor. I was just reading a little bit about Julius Chestnut and how maybe he and Hassan Haskins, you hope that the organizations, when they finally get to see the rookies play, say, okay, see them on the field. Well, this is the investment we had in this player, but it's obvious that doesn't indicate the difference between the players. And maybe the undrafted player ends up taking that opportunity. So there's a lot of these guys, Abram Smith,
Jaquandre White,
Jashawn Corbin,
Kennedy Brooks,
of course. So all of these guys could be a James Robinson type in the sense that there's a story you can tell where they're already getting on the field. And that's the other thing we're looking for in OTAs. Who's getting on the field with the ones? David Bell.
We see it all the time, Bloom, and I'll interject here and hand it back to you. But we see it all the time. CJ Anderson, right? So we have to identify what did we see and how can we anticipate it early? Because this isn't anything rare. This happens a lot. So what are the identifying factors? And you're going to get better information now than you will in August when a guy will play in the fourth quarter of the preseason. But what does that matter? Okay, it does matter a little bit, but pay attention now. I guess that's basically what we're saying.
And Cecil, you told a good story about 4 members of the media there. It's not officially open to the media. There's not a lot of coverage of OTAs. I mean, there is coverage of OTAs because football fans, this is the sport overall that people obsess about more than any other professional sport in the United States. So you're going to get that round the clock ridiculous coverage, but a big difference. And see, you bring up the difference between preseason nuggets and OTA June nuggets, and it is that during August, everybody, it's a media feeding frenzy and things get amplified, right? Like really small things get amplified mountains out of molehills, etc.
Jamar Chase dropping footballs.
Sure,
Ooh.
exactly. So those things take on a presence that makes you feel like, well, I have to react to this. How can I not be adjusting this player down in my rankings? Whereas what you're seeing now, and again, I'll bring up Chestnut because it's Jim Wyatt, right? I mean, Jim Wyatt is at this point one of those emeritus beat writers where he's been around a team for so long that you just have to give a lot more weight to anything he says. And he says, yeah, Haskins is looking pretty good, but Chestnut is looking basically as good, or I keep noticing him. Isn't that an interesting choice of words, right? I keep noticing him. And what it tells me is maybe he's not watching him, but this player's exceeding his expectations. So let's start there. Not necessarily what the beat writer is saying explicitly with his words, but how you're noticing this player this writer that's been following the Titans since we started, right? He's one of the original beat writers we had on this show like 15 years ago.
Yeah.
If he's noticing Chestnut, then we should be noticing him too.
Noticing the Audible live and noticing our chat room commenting about Allen Robinson, Matt. So let's wrap up today's show. Again, I got to run. Apologize to everyone, but we're here for you. We're back, as my man VJ would say. But let's wrap up today's show with some talk about Allen Robinson. Now, with the opportunity, I guess we've all been waiting for, Matt. Well, what are we waiting for? What will we see?
Well, good luck. I mean, I think that's a fun topic to turn over here. And you could sit there and say, well, is he going to be second year in Jacksonville, Allen Robinson, who was practically dominant? Or are we looking at a player who no longer really is that? Or is this really a kind of more of the same, with Josh Gordon being kind of the extreme end of that spectrum, but really Allen Robinson fitting within that storyline, which is he is who he is at this point. And to me, what he is a 100 target player, but he's not a dominant player. And I think with, when people say, well, Cooper Kupp's going to cede that main role to Allen Robinson, I don't think so. Allen Robinson was kind of at the end of the Des Bryant era. He's a good route runner. He's a fine player, but what he did that was really strong that wasn't utilized a lot in recent years is going up and winning the football in contested situations, which is not really as big of a deal nowadays with a lot of the ways they play coverage. So I see Allen Robinson as like a 900 to 1,000 yard receiver in this offense, because I think Odell Beckham is going to come back there. I think they're still talking about having him there. Beckham, to me, makes Robinson really contesting with Beckham as the second or third option in this offense on the receiving core. I think Kupp still remains the top guy, mainly because he's so great at zone coverage and he's versatile at what you can do with him inside and out. Whereas Beckham also is the better route runner than Allen Robinson. So Robinson, to me, is a great third receiver on this team. But to me, that means you're looking at a 5 to 7 touchdown upside, 60 catches, 900 yards, somewhere around that range. Is upside if guys get hurt. Obviously, you could see an 80 or 90 catch season out of him. Maybe he gets you to that 1,300 yard territory and double-digit touchdowns. But my bigger concern really isn't just Robinson. It's Matthew Stafford. He's already getting an injection in his elbow. And that's not a good thing. You already got an injection in your elbow. You're over 35 at this point, and you have an injection in your elbow, your throwing elbow in the spring. John, better to learn about John Wolford or better to learn about whatever free agent that they bring up, because if Matthew Stafford, to me, I'm about a month or two away from deciding that he's not playing 17 games. He's playing 6 to 8. We'll see how that goes, if this injection turns out not to be a big deal. But, when former players say that's a bad sign, I tend to agree.
Yeah, you'd better learn about Drew Lock after Seattle cuts him. But Bloom, let's talk about this, if you'd like to interject about the Robinson situation. And then Reynard, to wrap us up here, he brings up something I think is very important for fantasy GMs, because is Treylon Burks this year's Jamar Chase? Burks having conditioning issues. Did they blame it on asthma? Was that a thing? Did that actually happen? and then drops in OTAs. These aren't preseason drops or training camp drops. These are OTAs drops. If you were to say who's had the worst, from being drafted till now, who's been the worst of all the top picks, it's been Burks in terms of the news cycle. The news has rarely been good about Treylon Burks. And honestly, I did want to talk about Robert Woods today. So if you want to sneak in a little Woods there too, Bloom, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, Woods is already out there making catches, some not at full speed. But, he suffered an ACL tear about halfway through the season last year. So that's a good sign. And that's something that caps Burks' opportunity. We were looking at Burks maybe having a Kelvin Benjamin kind of rookie year, right? Just by necessity. And Brian Tannehill isn't Cam Newton. Two Cam Newton references in the show somehow already. Yeah. But the point is, sometimes it's just volume, right? Volume is king in fantasy and all that. There was going to be volume. They were going to force him into the number one passing game role if Woods was slow to start the season. But that is looking better. And maybe Woods is the guy that we want to target out of this passing game. And then it is about the drumbeat. It's negative. It's negative on Burks. And it has time to change. But it's inauspicious, as they would say. This is not the start to a career that indicates that everything is going to be peachy keen, at least for this year. And the reason we don't compare him to Chase is he's not as skilled as Chase was coming out. There's not the foundation that Chase had to say, this is an aberration. He can shrug it off.
There's not the connection with his quarterback either.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And that's a very, it may well be.
It goes back to what you said earlier. They're dependent. It's a dependent position.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tennessee's offense is another one, guys, that I think is going to be a lot easier to defend this year than it has been.
He's a long way from Arkansas.
Down I-40, not that far, really.
Theoretically, yeah, literally, yes. Metaphorically, ask that Rakeem Boyd how well production at Arkansas translates. Sorry, Clayton, but he's a long way from Arkansas.
One nation under Hog. All right, that is a wrap today, everyone. Got to run. Appreciate you all for listening. Make sure to do those YouTube things. Like, comment, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell so that you never miss a vid, and watch the video all the way to the end. For whatever reason, that helps the YouTube algorithm and gets us in front of other people. So thanks for helping us grow this YouTube channel. Thanks for checking out footballguys.com. He's Sigmund Bloom. He's Matt Waldman. I'm Cecil Lammey. We're all incredible. And we're all incredibly grateful for you. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned and stay frosty.